Hello. No, you.
Just going to put you in context, is that all right? Okay, good morning everyone. I know a number of you in here, but if I don't, my name is Neil Crowther. I've been involved in Social Care Future since the beginning, and I'm leading the work we're doing around reframing, or trying to come up with a better story of the vision that we want. How do we tell our story to the public in a way that makes it attractive and compelling, and they feel it and they think it. And that's what this session's about, really. But we've got two sessions today. This morning, we're joined by Equally Ours, who we're going to be working with more deeply on this project as we take it forward. Equally Ours are experts on what's called framing, which I'm not going to try and explain now because you're going to find out about it over the next hour or so. This morning's session, so is really, we called it Framing 101. I know a number of you have been to these sessions before, a number of you might not have done. So we felt it was important always that we explain the theory and the concepts and the ideas that lie behind what we're trying to do. This afternoon's session, though, is about getting the work done. So we've already done quite a lot of work to understand how the sector talks about social care, how the media talks about social care, how the public think. And we're now moving it into the next phase of research. And what we need to start doing is to start thinking, how do we turn that vision that Martin shared with you at the start into metaphors, ideas that people can really grasp and understand? So we don't just want to change the words of social care, we want to change the visual story of social care as well, so it better fits our vision. So this morning's session is really about the broad theory, although there's going to be an exercise to get you working at the end. So it's my pleasure to introduce Alice, not Neil and Catherine, Alice and Catherine, who are going to be leading the session for us.
Thank you, Neil. I'm Catherine, and this is Alice, and it's a pleasure to be here today. As Neil said, we're from a charity called Equally Ours. We are an equality and human rights charity, and as Neil said, we lead a programme, a strategic communications programme, and we do a lot of work working with civil society organisations to help them to create change. So Neil's done an introduction, so I'm not going to do a big preamble. So this next hour and 15 minutes or so is all about how we communicate to create change. So we're going to start by looking at some facts about the British public.
Hi everyone, I'm not Neil Crowther, in case you haven't gathered. So let's dive in. 3/4 of us want fewer immigrants in Britain. We want to ban the burqa by a margin of more than 2 to 1. 63% of us say that fairness is about getting what you deserve, and only 26% say that it's about equality. Only 7% of us consider ourselves feminists. So I want you to just take a second and turn to the person next to you, introduce yourselves if you haven't already, and have a quick discussion of how do these statistics make you feel? Just talk about them amongst yourselves for a few minutes. Should we just share the same one? I'm going to put this here so it's not fine. Okay, if we could just kind of come back together as a room. I'm going to ask some of you to share how you feel about these facts. Does anyone want to shout out? Hi.
So the one about the burqa,
Mm-hmm.
so for me, what was quite interesting was to recognise some of my own prejudice within that.
Okay.
And for many, many years, I thought the burqa was a very oppressive thing, and I went to a conference facilitated by women that wore the burqa that reframed their own narrative around the burqa. So I was thinking, well, actually, I live in a bit of a bubble, and most of the people I love and care probably have very similar views. And a lot of the population probably have very similar views.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so you kind of took this fact at face value, thought that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Did anyone ask any questions about these? Did anyone find any of these facts hard to believe? Yeah? Hi, over here.
Not hard to believe, but depressing when you're facing it.
Yeah.
I suppose that because of the B word.
So loaded statements as in, do you think maybe, did you ask how the question was asked? Yeah? Hello, yes.
When I think about all the elements, I think about intersectionality, I mean multiple identities. And for me, I'm not surprised about those figures because my identity isn't fixed.
Yeah.
It's it's fluid, and we constantly try to put people into boxes, which disadvantages my multiple identities.
Yeah. Yeah?
Something about, I wonder about these people, if they would see themselves as people living in an intersectional way.
Yeah.
And actually, the boxes are really safe places to be when you are living in a world that is problem saturated, othering. So I think sometimes so I agree with Clinton, but not everybody has that experience. And I wonder about, those people that the statistics are based on, how would they see themselves?
Very good question. I want to ask, did anyone else wonder how these questions were asked? Did anyone want to know who they asked? Did anybody want to know where this data came from? What organisations gathered the data? Daily Mail. So we wondered, right, if maybe it's somebody with an agenda. Is that fair to say? I think I felt the same when I heard these facts. Did anyone think this?
Excuse me,
Yes.
you need to read it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I will read that out. So this headline says, British public wrong about nearly everything, survey shows. I know I felt like that. Thank you for pointing that out. So we've started with this exercise for two reasons. First, it was to show that, as I think a lot of you recognise, we have a lot of work to do here. Despite all the hard work that we put into communicating our issues, all our reports, our facts, our infographics, the way that a lot of us are communicating at the moment just isn't working and isn't breaking through. You asked where these stats came from. We have the data on where they came from here. They're all from fairly reputable organisations. The bottom left is from us. We did this research. The top left is from, sorry, I'll just go back so you can see them again. The 3/4 of us want fewer immigrants in Britain is from British Futures. We want to ban the burqa by a margin of more than 2 to 1 is from YouGov. The stat about fairness and equality is from us, Equally Ours, and only 7% consider ourselves feminists is from the Fawcett Society. So, we have, as I said, a lot of work to do. The way that we're communicating at the moment, that many of us are communicating, just is not breaking through with a lot of the general public. Secondly, this was to get us thinking about how we will respond to facts. So the way that most people communicate assumes that people work like this. So this is two stick people. The first one is saying, let me tell you why you're wrong. And the second person says, wow, thank you so much. Do people think that that's a common way that people communicate? Yeah? On Twitter, yeah, everyone's really civil there, yeah? No, unfortunately, that's often not how we work. Assuming that if someone is wrong, we can just tell them that they're wrong, and they'll say, "Oh, thank you, I see that I was wrong." Strangely, a lot of charities, a lot of campaigns do still communicate in that way. But as we've just seen, how we react to new information is complicated. Often when we hear new facts, like all of you in this room have just done, if they're facts that make us uncomfortable, it's very common to react with our emotions first and our intellect second. So we're more likely to question facts that we disagree with or that don't fit with our existing worldview. And we're more likely to look for reasons not to believe them, to ask questions like, who gathered this? What was their agenda? Who was asked? In short, we pay more attention to new facts that fit with what we already believe, and we're more likely to criticize facts that don't fit with what we already believe. And it's important to say that we all do this. This doesn't make us lazy or stupid. It's the way that our minds work. We take lots of shortcuts for plenty of good reasons. It's part of who we are as human beings. But it does mean that if we want to break through, if we want to persuade people and change people's minds and take them on this journey with us, we do need to start from a proper understanding of how people actually communicate. Which brings us to framing.
So, how do we stop our facts and our statistics bouncing off people? So, how do we tell stories that change hearts and minds? So, we use an approach called framing. How many here are familiar with framing already? Okay, experts? Ooh. And how many are new to this idea? Okay, that's helpful. So framing is based on cognitive science and anthropology, and it tells us how our minds actually work, so how we receive and process information. So simply put, we never ever communicate in a vacuum. We make sense of the world through our existing knowledge, so our experiences, our beliefs, our values, etc. And these stories about the world that we store in our brains are called frames. So to give an example, if I said I went to a cafe for breakfast this morning, what do you think? Shout out.
Coffee.
Coffee, yeah.
Eggs.
Eggs. Anything else? Croissant. Okay. Trendy, yeah. Time. Lots of money, maybe. Okay. So if I said, so for those of you who come from Manchester, so if I said I went to a cafe in the northern quarter, or for any Londoners here, if I said I went to a cafe in Shoreditch, what do you think? Big sigh. Flat white, yeah. Beard. Vegan. Avocado, someone say. Yeah, smash. Yeah. Okay, and finally, if I said I had my breakfast at a greasy spoon, what would you say? Delicious. Builder's brew, that's right.
I'd say you got lost.
So that's just one really simple example about, I said one word, cafe, and you were already understanding what that was. So you were drawing on your existing experience and knowledge of what a cafe is, or a cafe in the Northern Quarter, or a cafe in Shoreditch. So you bring all of that to bear on how you understand things in the present moment. So here is an example of another really common frame in society. Would anyone like to have a go and tell me what the story here that is being told? Sorry, yeah. So on the top left is an advert for the Conservative Party from Theresa May that says, "The Chancellor will freeze fuel duty once again, money in the pockets of hard-working people." And again, in the right-hand side, another ad from the Tories which says, "A tax cut for 24 million hard-working people." And then in the bottom left, you've got two headlines from two tabloids. One says, "Benefit splits on scroungers," and the other one said, "My dad is a lazy sponger." What's the story told here? What is the frame here? Anyone want to have a go? Hi.
Looks to me like Ben and us. So there's hard working and scrounging.
Yeah.
And it's really setting people against each other.
Yeah. Anything else? Yes, hi.
There's a kind of narrative that if you need help from the state, then you're in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And people who are working are having to pay for people who aren't working.
Yeah. Hi.
But it's also a frame in language like deserving and undeserving.
Yeah, that's right. So this is essentially the idea of the self-made person, often a self-made man. So the idea that if you just work hard enough and try hard enough, you can get where you want to be. Okay. So in actual fact, lots of people face multiple barriers, as you know. So it doesn't recognise the structural nature of society. It's all down to individual choice and individual grit. And it's sometimes referred to as the meritocracy myth. Has anyone heard that? It's a really, really common frame. It's so common that we often don't notice it. And it's in everywhere. It's in TVs, it's advert, newspapers, culture, films that you see. So it's a really good example because our brains are really, really good at recognising these familiar stories. And when we recognise that this plays into a story that we already know, we think of it in those terms. And I'm going to quote something from the Social Care Future report. So in other words, understanding means finding a story you already know and saying, oh yeah, that one. And once we've found that story, we stop processing, so we stop thinking about it. And as Alice said, our brains are quite lazy like that, so we take shortcuts when we can. So the question is, how do we use framing, so use this technique to build a compelling story that people will remember and that will help create the change that we want to see? So we've boiled it down to 5 key ingredients, and I'm going to read these out now, and we are going to go through them in more detail in a moment. So the first one is about values. So it's about rooting our stories in values to connect them to the things that really matter to people. The second key ingredient is around telling a different story, so a new story to the existing one, to the one you want to oppose. The third one is around talking about the better world you want to create, rather than talking about the harm that you want to stop. The fourth one is around linking personal stories to structures and to solutions, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. And the last one is around metaphors. So using metaphors to help stories stick in our minds, but using them with care. So before we look in more detail at these, we're just going to look at very quickly at 2 examples that have used this approach to communicating to influence public opinion in the last few years. So the first one is the Together for Yes campaign in Ireland to repeal the 8th Amendment, which banned all kinds of abortion. People familiar with this campaign? Okay, so this used a strategic communications approach to communicating. And in terms of results, 65% of the public voted for the 8th Amendment in the 1980s, and in 2018, 66 voted to remove it. So there was a massive turnaround in public opinion based on using this approach to communicating. The second example, deep breaths everyone, is this. However we feel about the referendum, the Leave campaign is probably the UK's most successful campaign using strategic communications approach. Did anyone see the TV programme, I think it was called Brexit and Uncivil War, which had Benedict Cumberbatch playing Dominic Cummings? Yeah, exactly. So you'll see that this was a very well-planned, data-driven, intentional campaign using this approach, so appealing to people's values, and we'll touch on that in a moment. So these are just 2 examples of how powerful this approach can be to influence public opinion and therefore to influence policy. Before we go back to the key ingredients, just a couple of words on audience. So this is very much today about how we talk, so how we communicate to create change. But as important as that is actually who we're talking to. So you mentioned earlier actually about this thing called the echo chamber. So we tend to quite often talk to the people who already agree with us. Do you recognise that? So yeah. So we often do that, or we waste time on people who will never ever agree with us. We have done some work on the human rights, looking at what the public think about human rights and feel about human rights. And on the back of that work, we came up with a very, very broad segmentation of the British public, which has then been repeated over different social issues. So you, broadly speaking, have the pro, so the people who agree with you, and in that piece of research is around 22% of the population. And then you have the anti, the people who are never going to be on your side, and that was approximately 26%. Then you have a smaller segment called we call the apathetic. So they're people who don't really care either way. So they're not interested in politics, they don't read the news, for example. So again, they are not worth wasting our time and energy on. And then that leaves us with quite a big segment, which is approximately 40% of the population. And this segment is sometimes called the conflicted segment. Has anyone heard that term before? So they are people who both agree and disagree. So they tend to move between those two positions. So in principle, in the case of human rights, they agree with human rights, but they have concern about how human rights are applied. So they think they've gone too far, for example. And again, as I say, this group of people have been found in research across lots of different social issues. Because they are exposed to a daily diet of sort of negative stories about different issues, they tend to believe them. But because they are conflicted, it means that they are also persuadable. So that means that they can be persuaded to a more positive, constructive, progressive view. And we would also include quite a few politicians within this group and policymakers. And it's actually this group that politicians are most concerned about. It's this group of people, for example, that the Tories would speak to a lot for the last election. So in the work that we do, and the work that a lot of organisations that ingredients was to root stories in shared values. So our values are really the things that we care about. There are deeply held beliefs, and by rooting our stories and our messages in these values, we can connect them to the things that people really care about. So lots of research has been on values, and there is a number of values that have been shown to consistently occur across different values and different cultures. And they sit on a spectrum, and the ones that we're interested in for this purpose are two sets of values. So one are called, we'll call them compassionate values or good values, and the others are the more selfish values, sometimes called extrinsic values. So we all have all of these values, but different people place different emphasis on different ones. So to persuade people to support our causes, what we want to do is to appeal to people's compassionate values, so appeal to people's better selves, essentially. So it works a bit like this. This is a seesaw. So when we engage people's compassionate values, and here are some examples at the top. So we have social justice, freedom, equality, honesty, and care for others. We temporarily suppress or selfish values. So some examples bottom left are selfish and influence. So values work a little bit like muscles. So when we activate a particular value in our communications, the stronger it becomes in people's minds, which is why when we communicate, we need to steer clear of making arguments based on things like power and influence. So these selfish values in the bottom right. So the Together for Yes campaign that I mentioned a moment ago is fundamentally and intentionally about the values of care and compassion. So asking the question, what sort of country do we want to be? Is Ireland a country that cares about women, for example? So it started with the values, and it showed how the country's record on abortion and the harm caused by the current law is falling short of those values. And similarly, take back control. So the heart, the slogan that we heard again and again and again at the heart of the Leave campaign is a value-based message. So it's based on the values of self-direction, which combines freedom and control. So just to say, this is not about not using facts at all. Of course, facts are important. It's just about how we deploy facts. So if you root them in values, it makes it much, much harder for people to argue against your point or your problem. So the second key ingredient is this one. I'm going to hand back to Alice.
So I think, especially from listening to talks earlier this morning, it sounds like all of you in here and people who are part of Social Care Future, you're actually doing quite well on this. You know that there's a need to tell a new story about social care. Just to kind of hit home how important this is and what this looks like in practice, we're going to do a quick experiment. So I'm about to ask all of you to close your eyes for 5 seconds. And in that 5 seconds, you can think about whatever you like, but you just can't think about an elephant. Is that okay? All right, no elephants, got it? Okay, close your eyes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Open your eyes. Great, so no one thought of an elephant, right? What did you all think of? Did someone think of an elephant? I heard elephant over. Told you not to think of an elephant. Yeah, so you'll be unsurprised to learn that many people think about an elephant when they do this exercise. That's quite a natural way for our brains to work. If I say don't think of something, you are probably going to think about it. But what does this mean for our campaigns? So when we have opponents spreading false claims or misinformation about our issues or making kind of arguments in bad faith, it's our instinct very often to say, no, that's not how it is. We want to jump on that as quickly as possible. We want to address that. I see some of you nodding. Yeah, I feel the same. Often the way that we do that is we repeat the claim and then we say, but that's not true. Here is why. And very often that claim, things like, I'm about to give you an example, but very often that lies are very simple. Very often that claim right along with it, which maybe people won't have the time to read. This can actually backfire. You will be unsurprised to know. When we repeat our opponent's claims, firstly, we're giving them free publicity. We're helping them get that claim out further and further. And even if we're repeating it to explain why it's wrong, very often people just remember that first pithy, easy to remember thing that we said. They don't remember our debunking of it, especially because we are normally people who have an interest in debunking it. So here's a really famous example. We're going to talk about Brexit again, yay! So we have up here the infamous red bus that says on it, we send the EU £350 million a week, let's fund our NHS instead. Is that true? No? I'm going to say that wasn't true. And here is just a sample of the many, many articles that came out saying this is not true, and here is how we know it's not true. We've got there The Guardian, BBC News, The Telegraph, 38 Degrees, BuzzFeed, Fact Check. So many outlets were out there immediately saying, this isn't true, don't worry, we've got the facts. Do you think that worked? No? No. Who wants to guess if the British public still believe that we send 350 million a week to the EU and we could use that to fund the NHS instead?
80%, 60%.
Oh, 80 over here, 60? 20? Okay. It's a bit better than 80 and 60. 4 in 10, so 40%, still believe that claim. So all the myth busting in the world, we have such an urge to do it, but it often just doesn't work. as I said, it's free publicity. It's making people think of an elephant, basically. An example related to your work could be if you wanted to address the myth that we as a country can't afford to fund social care. You might say something like, yes, it will be hard to fund social care, but as a country we all have to make sacrifices to make it work, and if we all band together, you're still making people think about the cost and making people go straight to that oft-repeated claim that we just can't afford this. So we have to tell a different story instead, which I'm really pleased to see Social Care Future are already starting to do and already working on, so we are way ahead of a lot of other people who we train on this, is the good news. We're now going to look at our third key ingredient.
So this one is the one about needing to talk about a better world we want to create. So rather than talking about all the bad things and all the crisis and everything we talk about as if it's the end of the world, it's a very, very common trap to fall into because you want people to sit up and listen. But when we do that, this happens, fatalism. So fatalism, as I'm sure you know, no point in trying